Okay, I would like to begin. Let's get settled down. Okay, let's begin with a word of prayer. Help us this day as we have our class on the historical developments of the church's view on abortion and how they have responded to it in times past and recently. I pray that you will help us to understand and appreciate the importance of the history. Help us to learn lessons from it and be with me also as I try to teach this class and strengthen and give me grace. All this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, in my previous lesson related to abortion, I spoke of abortion and the feminist movement, how abortion became tied up with feminism and how it became associated with women's rights. And if you recall, my main thesis was essentially that men basically hoodwinked women into believing that abortion was good for them. So that was the story that I told in previous lesson last year, and today will be a lesson focusing on the church, how Christians have responded to abortion and the way the teaching of the church on abortion has evolved. And I think there are some important lessons for us to learn from there as well. Okay, so the church's view on abortion, I will be looking at the early church and present day for most of the part. Okay, so overview, abortion, contraception and infanticide in ancient Rome, response of the early church, early Protestantism, and Protestant drift. Okay, which is when they started to advocate for abortion. First, we look at the context, the background into which the early church, found themselves. It was ancient Roman society, and as our brother Manoj has spoken of previously in one of his lessons, the ancient Romans would frequently expose unwanted babies that were deemed defective or simply because they were girls. They would be left outside to die, exposed to the elements and the beasts. But besides that, there was also direct infanticide, directly killing their babies. These were deemed acceptable as well in Roman society. And remarkably, I found, right, that they also had the use of oral contraceptives in the days of the ancient Roman Empire. What exactly they were, we don't know. We don't know now because the names of the certain plants that they used to turn into potions to drink and all that. The identity of these plants are not really known to us, but it's believed that they do actually function somewhat like the modern contraceptives. Right? So Augustine actually uses the phrase "poisons of sterility." So they actually had these things in ancient Rome as well, and they also had oral abortifacients. They did use these as well in ancient Rome. So abortion, contraception, infanticide, exposure of infants, all these were considered acceptable in ancient Rome. And there was even surgical abortion. There will be a description of it later. The response of the early church. Okay? The early church was known for taking in these abandoned babies, right? Many of them baby girls. And these girls would grow up in the church such that the church would have a very large gender disparity. There will be a lot of women in the church. And as a side note, this was used as a point to make fun of the Christian church. Like, you're full of uneducated, stupid women. Yeah. The early church also took a stand against abortion, and they upheld the biblical sexual ethic. Okay. So we will see a bit more of that from the sources. The first source here is the Didache, which is also called the teachings of the apostles. And this is the source is not really, the authorship is not really known, but it is, can be safe to say, a manual of Christian instruction and teaching in the very early church, because it's thought to have originated in the late 1st century. So that is how ancient this document is. And it says in chapter 2, among the other prohibitions and moral commands that it gives, do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not have sex with children, do not be sexually promiscuous, do not steal, do not practice magic, do not use drugs. Okay, this is related to witchcraft. Okay, do not abort a child or kill babies. Okay. Do not yearn to possess things that belong to your neighbor. Okay, so this is a testimony to the fact, right? Not just that they stood against abortion, but that it was practiced in ancient Rome. The testimony of the church is fairly uniform. It's very uniform. That the humans have souls at conception. Human life begins at conception. They put forth various arguments from that. Right? Argument from John the Baptist, who remembers the occasion when Elizabeth met Mary, right? And then the babe in Elizabeth's womb leaped, right? Because that was his savior over there in Mary's womb. And so from there they also drew the argument that even from conception, even in the womb, they are human lives. They have souls. And Jeremiah 1 verse 5 or so, when God says to Jeremiah that he had called him from his womb, right? And according to the early church, right, naturally, since humans have souls at conception, they are human from the start. Abortion kills a human being. And as will become noteworthy later on, they also spoke against contraception, right? Against what they call the poisons of sterility. I'll give a smattering of quotes from the early church. And first is from Tertullian. There'll be quite a few from Tertullian, because Tertullian actually wrote a lot about abortion and the human life in the womb. And here he describes a surgical abortion that was current in his days. Okay, so here there's also an argument about infants being alive. So infants are stillborn, but how so? Unless they had life. Okay, how do we consider an infant who have died when he did not have life in the first place? Right? For how could any die who had not previously lived? But sometimes by a cruel necessity, whilst yet in the womb, an infant is put to death. Accordingly, among surgeons' tools, there is a certain instrument which is formed with a nicely adjusted, flexible frame for opening the uterus, first of all, and keeping it open. It is further furnished with an annular blade, by means of which the limbs within the womb are dissected with anxious but unfaltering care, its last appendage being a blunted or covered hook, wherewith the entire fetus is extracted by a violent delivery. There is also another instrument in the shape of a copper needle or spike, by which the actual death is managed in this furtive robbery of life. They give it, from its infanticide function, the name Embryos Factes, the slayer of the infant, which was, of course, alive. Tertullian continues to write, the doctors who perform abortions all knew well enough that a living being had been conceived, and they pitied this most luckless infant state, which had first to be put to death to escape being tortured alive. In our case, a murder being once for all forbidden, we may not destroy even the fetus in the womb, while as yet the human being derives blood from the other parts of the body for its sustenance. To hinder a birth is merely a speedier man-killing, nor does it matter whether you take away a life that is born or destroy one that is coming to birth. That is a man which is going to be one. You have the fruit already in its seed. Tertullian was around 3rd century, by the way. Minucius Felix, early church apologist. There are some pagan women who, by drinking medical preparations, extinguish the source of the future man in their very bowels, and thus commit a parasite before they bring forth. And these things assuredly come down from the teaching of your false gods. To us Christians, it is not lawful either to see or hear of homicide. Chrysostom, 4th century. Wherefore, I beseech you, flee fornication. Why sow where the ground makes it its care to destroy the fruit? He is speaking of prostitutes. Where there are many efforts at abortion, where there is murder before the birth, for even the harlot you do not let continue a mere harlot, but make her a murderess also. You see how drunkenness leads to prostitution, prostitution to adultery, adultery to murder. Because many of these people in the ancient Roman world, right, visited these brothels, and mingled with the pagan priestess, right, who would, with whom they would have sexual intercourse, and then the women then being pregnant would abort. Athenagoras, we say that those women who use drugs to bring on abortion commit murder and will have to give an account to God for the abortion. We don't need to spend too much time on the early church. The testimony is clear and uniform. To summarize their stand, the fetus has a soul from the moment of conception. Life begins at conception, the early church taught. And therefore, right, by logical consequence, killing a child in the womb is equivalent to killing a born infant. Killing a child in the womb is equivalent to killing a man. Right? It is murder all the same. And the crux of the matter, of their argument, was that abortion destroyed a human life. And this dimension of abortion, right, would get ignored and neglected in the days of the centuries leading up to the 20th century, right? And even today as well. Abortion destroys a human life. That was it. That was it for the early church, right? No other arguments about the circumstances of the mother or anything. We do not need to speak much of the medieval church. The Roman Catholic Church, right, uniformly stood against, obviously, a prohibited abortion, right? And the early Protestants who came out of the Roman Catholic Church also did not repudiate the Catholic Church's stance against abortion. They also saw abortion as morally abhorrent. They also saw abortion as murder. Luther, teaching on the passage where Onan, remember the son of Judah who did not want to bring up seed for his brother, and he spilled his seed on the ground instead of impregnating Tamar, and God struck him dead. Luther says, God wanted to teach and attest that the beginning of children is wonderfully pleasing to him, in order that we might realize that he upholds and defends his word when he says, "Be fruitful." He is not hostile to children as we are. How great, therefore, the wickedness of human nature is. How many girls there are who prevent conception and kill and expel tender fetuses, although procreation is the work of God. Okay? So in the days of early Protestantism, also there was abortion, there was attempts at abortion. John Calvin. Now this is an interesting verse. Exodus 21:22. Why don't we can look at it now? Okay, because this becomes one of the verses that gets debated in the in the abortion debate. Okay, Exodus 21:22. If men strive and hurt a woman with child, so that her fruit depart from her, and yet no mischief follow, he shall be surely punished, according as the woman's husband will lay upon him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. And if any mischief follow, then thou shalt give life for life. Okay, this verse has been quoted in modern days as evidence that the Bible does not teach that the life of the fetus is as valuable as the life of a born human. Because they say that so that her fruit depart from her in verse 21 refers to a miscarriage, the baby dying. But all that happens is after that, the man who caused that miscarriage just pays money, and that's it. He doesn't die, right? He only dies if the mother dies. Okay? But that has not been the historic interpretation of this verse. In fact, it is quite interesting, as in the 20th century, when the Protestant church went to advocate for abortion, and then went back to advocate against abortion, you can see interpretations of this verse like in one way, and then after that the other way. Okay, so the actual interpretation of the verse for so that her fruit depart from her refers to a premature labor, not an actual miscarriage. So the baby might survive. Okay, but the mischief that follows means the baby dies. Then he pays life for life. So actually, the Bible here teaches that the life of the fetus is just as valuable. Okay? Calvin writes, the fetus, though enclosed in the womb of its mother, is already a human being, and it is almost a monstrous crime to rob it of the life which it has not yet begun to enjoy. If it seems more horrible to kill a man in his own house than in a field, because a man's house is his place of most secure refuge, it ought surely to be deemed more atrocious to destroy a fetus in the womb before it has come to light. So that's the testimony of early Protestantism. Our subsequent story here will be focusing on the story of abortion in America and the American church, right? Because in a way, that's where we see the most abundant records and lively debate and struggle, and how and that it also sort of spills over into the rest of the world, how we think and debate on this issue. Okay, so we turn to the New World, the colonists who traveled the Atlantic to reach the land of America. Okay, as you know, the America was settled by many English Protestants fleeing persecution, and the early colonists still saw abortion as sin and the murder of a child. The Protestant church saw it that way as well, and they did not have a need to convince their parishioners. They all knew it was wrong. Okay? But over time, right, in the next few centuries, right, the liberal and mainline evangelical churches, right, in the later part of the 19th and 20th centuries, would sort of advocate for liberalization of abortion. There would be this drift in the Protestant church, while the Catholic Church would remain firm on abortion. Okay. So we look first at this case, at the case of Captain William Mitchell. Right? This is the first abortion case with solid records in colonial America, happening in 1652. Right? So Mitchell had a midlife crisis, at the end of the English Civil War, what to do with his life now. And in London, right, he met this Susan Warren, young, beautiful woman, right? And he said that he would marry her, bring her across the Atlantic to Maryland and build a new life there, right? Of course, the problem was they were both married and not to each other. But anyway, Susan Warren made the decision to travel to the West with Mitchell without her husband. And Mitchell's wife mysteriously died on the voyage. And when they were in Maryland, right, Mitchell and Warren lay together. Warren becomes pregnant. And Mitchell went back on his promise to marry her. He forced an abortifacient on her in the form of some sort of poached egg, which he forced down her throat and made her eat it. And it caused her to expel the fetus. And of course, this bloody affair was not hid. People found the body of the fetus was found. Of course, Warren survived, but that thing poisoned her. So she lost most of her hair and all that. So this became a case. It became a case, and Mitchell had to stand trial for this. Now Mitchell had already a reputation as a blasphemous and profane man, right? In a time when most were at least culturally Christian, right, and many more probably sincerely Christian than are today, right? Mitchell was an avowed unbeliever, right, calling Jesus and the Holy Spirit a man and a pigeon. So he was a man of not a reputable character. This is what the prosecutor in the case said. Captain Mitchell tried to draw others to believe there is no God, making a common practice by blasphemous expressions and otherwise to mock and deride God's ordinances and all religion, and to destroy or murder the child by him begotten in the womb of said Susan Warren. Okay. There was no doubt in the minds of the public then among the colonists that abortion was murder and a grave sin against God. And this is what Susan Warren is recorded to have said. It was a great sin to get it, right, to lie with him and become pregnant, but a greater sin to make it away. Okay, right? Granted, she was forced, right? I mean, it was forced onto her, but she may have still felt a measure of guilt of being a part of doing that. Or of course, it is the sin of Mitchell who did away with the child. Okay. Now, the end of the case was that actually Mitchell was not convicted with for the death of the child, right? While they held that abortion was wrong, and there will be other cases like that in the times of in these colonial times, it was exceedingly hard to prove that that person caused the death of the child. So a lot of men who did these things to the women that they got pregnant, or by beating them or by forcing them to take the abortifacients, they got away with it eventually, right? Because the evidence to show it actually is very hard to nail down. Yeah. So this is from a book, The Story of Abortion in America, a street-level history, covering 350 years. It's an amazing read. Recommend you get that book, right? Written by Martin Olasky and Leah Savas. They write, in an era of frequent Bible reading, few miss God's creative involvement in human life from its beginning. Colonists read in Psalms, Job, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Luke, Galatians, and other books, not only that we are made in God's image, but that He knitted me together in my mother's womb, formed me in the womb, and formed you in the womb. So those were the days of early colonial America, right? In the 17th and 18th centuries, abortion was unsafe, definitely illegal, but fairly rare. But in the late 18th century and come 19th century, right, specialized abortionists began to come onto the scene. Right? People who, maybe not necessarily doctors, but who specialize in getting rid of the fruit of the womb. And these came on the scene, and they started to make abortion a bit safer with their techniques. Okay, but the antibiotics era wasn't then yet, so there was still quite a bit of danger involved. Okay, so specialized abortionists began coming onto the scene, but it's still illegal. Okay, still illegal, but they are there. Their services were in demand, right? And they made a lot of money. Right? They would advertise their services under euphemisms. Right? Well, the most famous euphemism is relief of obstructed menses. Treatment of relief of obstructed menses. Really, that was how it was advertised. Right? And the famous abortionists made a lot of money, all while evading the law. Right? One famous one was someone called Madame Restel. Right? Her real name is not French, but being French makes it sound more reputable. Right? And everyone knew that she did abortions. Right? Everyone knew where her house is, her opulent lifestyle, and they knew where the money came from. Everyone knew she did abortions. If you wanted an abortion, she was the one to go to. But abortion was illegal. But they never arrested her. Well, there was one time they arrested her briefly, and then because of the influence that she had with all the rich and powerful people being her patrons, and how much her service was in demand, she got off scot-free for many years. And there were many of these abortionists. Everyone knew did abortion, but you wouldn't get arrested. Or if you get arrested, you just bribed your way out of it. Right? And the media helped a lot as well, right? Helped to protect these abortionists. And here we see the shift of the focus now only to the woman. Okay? Of course, abortion was still illegal, and where there's crime, there is news, right? But cases of abortion tended to only make the news when the woman died. You're an abortionist? You can kill as many babies as you want? Sure, yeah, it's illegal, but they won't arrest you for that. But the moment you kill the woman, then you're in trouble. Right? So cases of abortion only made the news when the woman died. Actually, I might add, there are other cases when it made the news, was that when the body of the infant was found. They did not properly dispose of the body of the infant, they did not properly hide it or what. They find the body of the infant, and then something is made of this. Yeah. So that was the time of the 19th century in America. Official church teaching was still that abortion is wrong, right? And the law still said that abortion, right, is wrong. But this is what was happening. The church's voice fell silent in the 19th century, even though they knew that this was going on. Right? What are the reasons, right, for it? Sexual sin, common among the churchgoers, with many resorting to abortion or forcing the women they get pregnant into abortion. Some ministers themselves also found themselves in need of an abortion. Okay. Ministers hardly preach on this topic, despite knowing that abortion was happening. There was a fear of offending the congregation. Although all this time the church teaching was still officially against abortion. And this silence of the church, right, will cause them to suffer rebuke from doctors who saw that abortion was wrong, who saw that abortion killed a human life. We have writings and records of these doctors, right, castigating and rebuking the ministers of the churches for keeping silent on this issue. Right. He said, you are supposed to speak up on this. Right? Why aren't you speaking up? While the ministers, for their part, sort of abdicated their authority to speak on this issue and say that it is a medical issue. Right? But the doctors were saying, you are supposed to speak up. Some pastors, after the Civil War, risked backlash by speaking of slavery and abortion as twin evils. The General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America came to a similar conclusion, declaring that it viewed the destruction by parents of their own offspring before birth with abhorrence. Most pastors during the last quarter of the 19th century were not so clear. Pastors thought a plain sermon upon it from the sacred desk would strike directly at many professed Christian members and give such mortal offense that the offender would preach to slim audiences ever after, if at all. Right? There'll be no one left in my church if I preach against abortion. A certain pastor contended. Right? This was a pastor that was one of the exceptions who boldly preached against abortion. He said that many churchgoers would be astonished to hear that they are not Christians, given their lackadaisical attitude toward abortion and sometimes their emergency patronage of abortionists. So this was the 19th century. Abortion, illegal, church teaching also against abortion, but reality, right? Many specialized abortionists, many people going to abortionists, right? The media protecting the abortionists, even sometimes the police protecting the abortionists, right? And the church afraid to exercise its moral authority to speak against abortion. We come to the 20th century when this silence on the issue would lead to actual drift in their teaching. So in the 20th century, the Protestant would drift in its stand on abortion. One of the very important issues was the separation of contraception and abortion that the Protestant churches did, right? And also questions of the welfare of the mother, fetal deformities, all the what ifs, right? And also the efforts of the birth control and abortion advocates successfully winning over the Protestants. Okay. So first we'll talk about birth control and contraception. Okay. In the 1920s, 30s, 40s, birth control advocacy was going strong, right? There were these Malthusian worries about overpopulation and having too many mouths to feed, right? And children being born into poverty would be a burden, and they would be locked in there to suffer for a life of poverty and want, right? And children with fetal deformities will live a life of suffering and all that. And so the advocacy for contraception and birth control was very strong, right? But in the 19th century, certain legislations in some states in the US had drawn a link between contraception and abortion, right? Like a law prohibiting a doctor from both prescribing and recommending some contraceptives and also abortions. So there was a link established through legislation in the 19th century. And in the 20th century, actually, I mean, not just the 20th century, but long ago they've already done that. But in the 20th century, Catholics would emphasize also this link between contraception and abortion, right? And the Catholics' opposition to contraception and subsequently, in consequence, abortion was based on natural law, right? That contraception went against the natural purpose of sexual intercourse, went against God's design, right? Which is that sexual intercourse is for procreation, and so contraception undermines and goes against that nature. So Catholics will remain firm on this. But what about the Protestants? Protestants, however, wary of anything that remotely smells Catholic, rejected their view of natural law. They rejected natural law, and they separated the issues of contraception and abortion. Okay. Protestants would begin to advocate for contraception use as a positive moral good, you know? It's like, oh, if you're not ready for a child yet, you can use contraception, right? If you think that a child will have a difficult life and all that, if you can't manage, you can use contraception to prevent being pregnant, because once you're pregnant, you cannot abort, you know? Yeah, they still stood against abortion. Right? They still saw it as the killing of a human life. But this separation between contraception and abortion, and more fundamentally, their their rejection of history and the neglect of history and tradition, right, as characterized in their rejection of natural law, right, would have consequences for the church later on. Okay. So related to this whole issue of contraception and abortion, we asked two questions. First, would the use of contraceptives reduce abortion? Would they reduce abortion? Would they reduce demand for abortion? Second, can one consistently allow for contraceptive use while not allowing for abortion? Can that be done? While the Protestant church would have been happy to answer yes to both questions, subsequent history of abortion in America would demonstrate that it was very difficult to provide a positive, affirmative answer to both these questions. Now, I'm not making a judgment on these questions. I'm saying that the history showed that it was very difficult to answer yes to both these questions. It is from the book Defenders of the Unborn. Though 19th century Protestants had often conflated contraception and abortion, Protestants of the mid-20th century separated the two issues, approving of one as a beneficial social good, while condemning the other as the taking of a human life that should be performed only in extreme circumstances. But Catholics were convinced that a compromise on contraception would inevitably lead to an acceptance of abortion, and they became increasingly vocal in their defense of the natural law principles that condemned both practices. Indeed, in their successful campaign against a referendum to legalize birth control in Massachusetts in 1948, they claimed that birth control was like abortion and against God's law. But natural law theology gained little traction among Protestants who had long-standing suspicions of Catholic theology and who, by the mid-20th century, had become especially skeptical of Catholics' argument that contraception violated a universal natural law. Williams goes on to write that birth control advocates like Margaret Sanger, the founder of the organization that would become Planned Parenthood, right, they saw contraception as an anti-abortion measure. Okay? It is worth noting that Margaret Sanger appeared to not actually have been in favor of abortion too much. Okay? So they saw contraception as an anti-abortion measure since women would likely have fewer illegal abortions if they had a more convenient and safer way to limit their fertility. Catholics disputed this claim. They argued that legalized birth control would actually increase the abortion rate because people who had been encouraged to try to avoid pregnancy would resort to any means at their disposal, even an illegal abortion, if their contraceptive devices failed. I believe the history has shown that the Catholics were right on this count. So you see Protestants, right? First, accepting contraception. Birth control, okay, became more and more widely used in America. Right? The pill, right? Through the efforts of birth control advocates like Margaret Sanger. In 1930, okay, this marks the first Protestant communion to make an official statement on this matter. They gave a cautious endorsement, or rather the first to endorse, the cautious endorsement of contraception while still maintaining a stand against abortion. And after the 1930s onwards, many Protestant ministers all gave support for use of contraception. But this attempt to maintain, right, a permissiveness for contraception and forbidding abortion, right, would be difficult to keep up, as we see. By rejecting Catholic natural law-based arguments against birth control, Protestants made it more difficult to use those arguments against abortion. By the time that abortion policy became a matter of political controversy, most Protestant denominations had no consistent theological position on the subject. So the drift continues. Beginning with the more liberal denominations, Protestants would come out in droves in support of legalization of abortion. Okay, this is still before Roe v. Wade. Many states had statutes against abortions, and the abortion activists were working for what we call abortion law reform, right? Abortion law liberalization, and Protestants would be joining their cause, right? Mostly won over, right, by arguments about the welfare of the woman, right? Or basically utilitarian arguments, right? Say that they began to defend abortion based on self-defense. You know, the baby is threatening your life. Well, not literally. Yeah, you're not literally going to die, but you know, your general well-being and your self-determination, right? These are part of your life also, and so for that reason, right, you feel uncomfortable with the child, right? Because that is they didn't say it that crassly, but that is a logical end to it, right? And also utilitarian arguments based on for the cases of fetal deformities, you know, like a child was, if they find out that a child is a high likelihood of being born with deformities, very serious deformities, right? It is an act of mercy to not let the child be born and suffer a life, right? With this deformity, right? Before Roe v. Wade, before Roe v. Wade in 1973, right? There was the case of this Sherry Finkbein, right? Someone who had, who like many women had been taking a particular supplement or medicine, right? That's not related to pregnancy at all. But then some study came out that showed that actually that's linked to fetal deformities, and she wanted an abortion, and couldn't get it, right? And actually, her case was quite publicized. She was on TV and all that, and her story was very moving, right? Well, the Catholics had a consistent response to that, right? Abortion is murder. However, Protestants were behind her, saying that that's a brave choice you're making and all that. She eventually went overseas to get an abortion. She left for Europe to get an abortion. Yeah, and the Protestants called her a hero. In 1961, the National Council of Churches passed a resolution that condemned most abortions, but that also explicitly allowed them in cases when a woman's life or health was in danger, and suggested continued study of the issue. In 1962, the United Presbyterian Church passed a resolution in favor of uniform state therapeutic abortion laws throughout the nation, though it left the specifics of those laws unstated. Their invocation of the principle of self-defense to justify abortions in extraordinary situations had widened to include not only the necessity of preserving a woman's life, but also her health. Okay? So we see the drift beginning, right? Starting to support abortion choice. Right? Quite key in this also was the efforts of abortion advocates like Lawrence Lader, whom we met in my last lesson on abortion. He is the one who convinced Betty Friedan, right, the leader of the women's organization and a pioneer of the second wave of feminism, who initially was not for abortion, but he convinced her that abortion was good for women and that the women's organization should adopt it as a plank. So this is the man behind it. Okay. And he also recruited Protestant ministers to his cause. Okay. Another thing that helped was the favorable coverage in media. As we saw in the 19th century, so also in the 20th century. Right? Media stories tended to cover things in a light favorable to abortion choice, right? No, even this time it's still before Roe v. Wade, so it's still not legal in all states. So even the media still also help the abortion activists. Okay? And after the liberals, right, mainline evangelicals joined in droves. Okay? So in the beginning, theological liberals led the way. In Lawrence Lader's words, we needed a breakthrough. So it was tremendously important when the clergy, the cloth, came to help. I cannot overestimate this. Later, in 1966, talked with activist New York pastor Howard Moody about channeling women to abortionists. They began meeting once a month with like-minded ministers and rabbis. After 6 months later, impatient, forced the issue by speaking publicly about forming a clergy consultation service on abortion. After the mainline churches came the evangelicals. They had no pope or college of cardinals, but they did have Christianity Today, the leading evangelical voice. It's a magazine. The magazine ran a neutral article on abortion in 1966. Right. In 1968, a cover story declared that a consensus of 25 evangelical scholars said the Christian physician will advise induced abortion only to safeguard greater values sanctioned by Scripture. These values may be individual, societal, or familial, or societal. Each case should be considered individually, taking into account the various factors involved and using Christian principles of ethics. Essentially saying nothing. Okay. Now, with the Protestants mainly now in favor of or not fighting against abortion, right? Later succeeded in dividing the Christian witness, right, against abortion. Right? He had a brilliant strategy, which was basically to isolate the Roman Catholic Church, label that as the enemy, get the Protestants on their side, and then to show America that it's just this small group of Catholics, right? They're not even the only church in America. They're even trying to dictate for other churches, right? It's just them, right? And so public opinion gradually began to be in favor of more and more in favor of abortion liberalization. And eventually, in the famous 1973 case of Roe v. Wade, right, the Supreme Court ruled that the Constitution protected the right to an abortion. Of course, we know now that it was overruled last year in 24th June, and we thank God for that. But there was, you could say there was something positive to have come out of Roe v. Wade for the churches, it came as a shock. It came as sort of a wake-up call to them as they realized how far culture had drifted and their own part in this. It came as a shock. And the pro-life movement, right, which was already alive before Roe v. Wade, would pick up momentum once again, would pick up the pieces from this defeat, and they would press on. And the pro-life movement would be very successful in bringing in many Protestants back to a position of protecting life. And Protestant denominations ended up reversing their previous positions after Roe v. Wade. Right? One example is a Southern Baptist convention. Right? But of course, it was still not an easy fight. The problems, right? The problems and the melodies in the Protestant church in the 19th and 20th centuries, right, still carried on. Ministers feared offending their congregations. Right? They knew how widespread abortion was. They knew that if they preached abortion, right, preached against abortion, they would lose, right, their church. They would lose their pulpits. It was not an easy fight. Right? As you know that R.C. Sproul, right, spent much of his life, right, fighting against abortion, trying to get Christians to speak out for abortion. And he said in 2014 that it's always the same old refrain when he showed pastors all these materials that he had prepared for them to give to their churches. They said, "We can't show this in our churches. It would split the church." The problems were still there. The problems are still there. Right. But we can at least thank God that the Protestant church has to some measure been called back from their previous drifting away from protecting life, and that now more and more seeing the importance of this issue. Right. And the fight is not done yet by any measure. Okay. Just a couple of observations on this history, particularly for Protestants. Right? Neglect of history and tradition led to confused ethics. Right? Being wary of they were wary of anything Roman Catholic, as I mentioned earlier, right? Rejecting natural law arguments, right? But already also we see in the early church, right, the arguments for abortion are basically there already. But sad to say, Protestants have a habit of neglecting history and tradition and are downplaying the importance of it in our ethics and how we approach issues. As a result of that, without a firm grounding in biblical ethics, they get the ethics from the world, the utilitarian ethics, right? It says if it's good for your well-being, just do it. The child is going to suffer anyway, so don't let him suffer in this life. Right? So the Protestants suffered, right, for their neglect of history and tradition. Right? They got their ethics from the world. They ended up adopting the positions of the world. Another observation, pretty uniform since the 19th century onwards, and ministers bowed to societal pressure to keep silent on this issue because they would be opposed for it. Yeah. they conveniently abdicated their authority to speak on this issue and say that it is between the woman and the doctor. This is entirely a medical issue. Let the medical professionals speak on this. And so they completely abdicated their authority, and it led to what we saw today. Okay, does anyone have any questions? That's all I have for today. Yep. Whether they would absolutely prohibit contraception. I won't give you the full details now, but if you adopt Catholic natural law, I really don't see any other conclusion that you really have to prohibit all contraception if you follow Catholic natural law. But should we follow Catholic natural law? Right? I mean, from my presentation, it does sound like we should have followed them. But my point is not that, right? It's that we do need to recover a biblical ethic, whole of life ethic that covers these issues: contraception, right, abortion, and we should humbly but also critically listen to the voice of our forefathers, right? In the early church, even the Catholics, right, they do have useful things to say, many useful things to say. Okay.
Medical students are generally taught that most contraceptive measures, I'm not talking about barrier methods like condom and diaphragms. They would say that, for example, the very commonly used pill that a lady can take daily prevents pregnancy by thickening the cervical mucus and preventing ovulation. But a very honest investigation into this shows that there are three major mechanisms for contraception. So any kind of hormonal contraception would prevent the first two that I mentioned, thickening of the mucus and preventing ovulation in some cases, but it always thins the endometrium. That's the inner layer of the uterus. Why would a woman have less and less menstruation after taking the pill for a long time? Because the lining of the uterus is made hostile to any possible conceptus. That is the fertilized egg or embryo. So what happens is that even if there's a breakthrough bleeding, and doctors would know, sometimes women ovulate even while on the pill. You will get pregnant. You will get pregnant in the sense of having a conception, right? Fertilization of the egg, which results in an embryo. But you would not get pregnant in the sense that the embryo will then bind to the lining of uterus and become viable. So what I'm saying is that even from a medical perspective, apart from natural law, which I know is debatable, but actually, I mean, this is not relevant to what I'm saying, but medically speaking, from a very consequentialist or utilitarian perspective, we can see that the end result of having this form of conception would be the forbidding of the embryo to actually utilize the lining of uterus to have nutrients and to grow. So, I mean, to put it in a very blunt way, in your face way, how is that different from an abortion? I mean, think about that. All right, that's how I see it from a medical perspective. IUDs, I know there are medical colleagues here who disagree with me. I know even among my colleagues who are generally pro-life disagree to some extent. But I believe that it's more due to not a different perspective of ethics, but more so from a lack of knowledge. So I think a good investigation into the various methods of conception will give us more information on what the end result would be. Even if we do not use natural law ethics, they call it classical natural law ethics, like some Catholic moral theologians use, you would still end up with the same conclusion that there is a dubious mechanism that we have to study on, reflect upon, and then come to a Christian ethical consensus on that.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, let's close this time in prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for this time that we could talk about the history of the Christian Church's thoughts on abortion, and we ask that you help us to take home the lessons from the past, and Lord, help us to be aware of the worldviews that we adopt. Help us, O Lord, to be bold in our witness for Thee and for the truth and for what is right, and help us to protect the life in the womb, this most vulnerable of all of us. All this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.